Hello and welcome to the first of 5 videos from the Roman Army lecture, the UofW on, this is sort of the wrap up, so it's going to be a bit on, veterans, and a bit on the army and the state and the emperor, really. Okay, so there'll be 5 videos. This is the first, and the first one we're going to look at emperors and war. Okay, so just a few highlights I want to share here. Click. Okay, so emperors and wars. The emperor is the state. The emperor, obviously, now we start in the late Republic, 100 BCE or so. So there's no emperors then. In that case, there is still a state, and I am sort of leaving out all that material. But there's plenty of research out there. If you're interested, email me and I'll let you know. But let's start off with something that is pertinent both for emperors, but also for earlier too. A big part of Roman thinking of war is the importance of victory, winning. We talked about a bit about life after war monuments, and the Romans tend not to have monuments to the dead. They tend to have monuments to victory, and this gets tied up with emperors. There are others, other individuals are able to celebrate victory to a certain extent, but less so when you have emperors. So I think we also talked just a little bit about the triumph, which is this big parade essentially to celebrate victory in a war, and it would go to a victorious commander, and there's certain process involved, elections or what have you. Once you get to the imperial era, it's darn near impossible for someone who's not an emperor to get one, of the members of the imperial family can, and there's a couple of exceptions here and there. But yeah, there's all sorts of different ways that victory is celebrated. So there's Trajan's column, obviously celebrated victory against the Dacians, which we've talked about before. There's Augustus's Res Gestae, which I think we've talked about as well. This is his deeds and accomplishments, big inscription, and there were many copies put up all over the empire, and it celebrated all sorts of stuff. And there's Triumph, which I've mentioned. Some of you, this was actually one of the topics I used for the biography assignment. Some of you looked at, I think, yes. Some of you looked at Titus Plautius Silvanus, an example of someone, this idea of victory, which in theory starts with the emperor and then works its way down, can also be manifested, amongst lower ranking members of the elite or whatever. So here is a guy who claimed and boasted that he brought 100,000 Transdanuviani across the river, made them tributary, suppressed the Sarmatians. This is a 1st century CE inscription, and had contact with the previous unknown peoples, and all these things. It's kind of surprising in some ways that he managed to do this. And he returned hostages and brought peace. And then there's also, of course, besides inscriptions like that, and then the boastful ones you also get on monuments, there's also, of course, all these triumphal arches, and we've only looked at really a couple of them, mostly the Arch of Titus in Rome, celebrating victory in the Jewish war. But those ones and other ones like the Arch of Constantine, also in Rome, are celebrate all sorts of different conflicts. The one in the Constantine one is, is interesting for other reasons as well, which I don't think we can get into. Right, so victory is a means of promoting your worth as an emperor. Okay, and a lot of quite often, emperors will boast of their success, even if maybe they weren't as successful as you might think. They might claim victory even in defeat. So there's all sorts of interesting things associated with this. And I think we have discussed before the actual word that comes to mean emperor, imperator. It had just been sort of a victorious title shouted by troops to their commander. And then, of course, the emperor is the only one who's allowed to do this. So it comes to be associated with him. But, for a while, princeps is the word. So there were all sorts of titles and things associated with emperors and victory as well. It's not just the monuments and the inscriptions. There are titles. We see this. Caligula, for instance, gives himself the triumphal title Germanicus for success against the Germans. But lots of emperors do this sort of thing, and it varies from emperor to emperor, and kind of in keeping with this idea of victory is political propaganda and maybe exaggerating the scale of your success. those who have the most titles aren't always those who we know were the most militarily active. So it's a bit, you can see they're definitely playing with the truth, their truth, whatever. So Trajan, for instance, gets titles like Germanicus, Dacicus, and Parthicus, was pretty legit because he had big success against Dacians and Parthians, and Aurelius, Marcus Aurelius, Armeniacus, Parthicus, Maximus, Medicus, Germanicus, Hermaticus. Those are pretty legit too, because the Armenians and Medicus and Parthicus all connected to wars against Parthia, and then Germanicus and Sarmaticus, the Marcomannic Wars. To give you a sense of how all this works in action, you can find them not just on inscriptions in various places, but even like some of these military diplomas that I've talked about. These little citizenship certificates for auxiliaries often include, the full titles at that year, which is partly why we know, or how we know, when to date them. So here's an example of one which opens with the Emperor Caesar Domitian, son of the divine Vespasian, Augustus, Germanicus, Pontifex Maximus, tribunician power for the 13th time, imperator 22 times, consul for the 16th time, permanent censor, father of the fatherland. So there's all this propagandistic stuff. Okay, now as far as so who are actually, how successful are emperors? And, I'm not going to, short video, I can't go through a lot, but I thought I'd just highlight the closest to reigning emperors when our three guys, Pulo, Polion, and Aemilianus were alive. Three characters from the book, which is hiding somewhere from this again, which we've been using throughout. So Pulo is the late Republic guy. Polion, sort of high empire, and Aemilianus, late empire. So we have Augustus, which is the closest we can get to Pulo. It's possible he was still alive when Augustus became emperor, although it's maybe not for long. So Augustus obviously did a lot of things. It's hard to deny he was super successful. He's probably the most successful emperor, known for his successes even in Roman times, military ones as well. He did lots of things for the military. He reorganized the provinces. He reorganized the military. He demobilized a whole bunch of troops and gave also shifted a whole bunch of them away from Italy to the provinces, in part to fend off barbarian attacks, but also to remove them from would-be pretenders to the throne. Created some new provinces, and I say professionalization. I don't know if I believe that anymore. There's been a couple of good articles that suggested otherwise, or at least made the standing army a permanent thing. And of course, he did though implement on a permanent basis. Connected to that, and actually maybe I should erase this. Made the standing army permanent. He made pay a regular facet of a soldier's career. And of course, I think I mentioned this before too, but here he is celebrating the return of the standards from Crassus's defeat to the Parthians. So that's not quite making a defeat into a victory, but it is boasting of a diplomatic success like it's a victory. Okay, Napoleon, I said probably alive late 2nd century into the early 3rd century. They're probably alive when Septimius Severus was emperor. There's lots of conflict during his reign. This is the famous giant bronze statue. I think it's 7 feet tall. We don't think he was 7 feet tall. It's just that the statue was. So he had strong ties to the military. He campaigned quite successfully, both when he took the throne after Civil War, when Commodus was killed, but successful wars against the Parthians in the east, which ultimately contributed to their demise, and then the uprising that led to the rise of the Sasanians who took over. That there's Septimius Severus. He recognized the power and importance of the military to him and his position, and one of the things he said to his sons, Caracalla and Geta, on his deathbed were, stick together, which of course they didn't. Caracalla killed Geta. Make the soldiers rich and despise all the rest. So to some degree that happened. He also made it slightly easier for soldiers to get married. Well, he possibly. Lots of conflict. Definitely had some military success and campaigned in Britain too, besides Parthia. Okay, and then we can jump ahead to just one of the emperors who was around when Aemilianus was around. Okay, and this is Julian the Apostate. I highlighted him just as an emperor who was short-lived, is super famous, and maybe wasn't terribly successful. He, not quite a usurper, but he was on his way to usurping the throne when his predecessor Constantius II died, and he reigned for less than 2 years, although it has 361-63. It was like 18 to 20 months. He saw himself as a philosopher Hellenist. He's called the apostate because they had been Christian emperors, Constantius II before him, and to some degree Constantine the Great. And he's like, no, let's go back to the old ways. So a lapsed Christian, part of the same Constantinian dynasty, but he had some definite military success when he was a Caesar, sort of a junior emperor, notably at Strasbourg, which is described in great detail by the historian Ammianus Marcellinus. But then he failed miserably in Persia and lost his life as they attempted to have an Alexander the Great-esque campaign. Anyway, so there's a little discussion of victory and so on connected to emperors and their connection to the military. And I looked at 3 emperors, different contexts over time. Okay, the next one I'll look more closely at emperors and soldiers.